Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazo.
Kamala Harris is inspiring and very capable. The more people get to know her, they're going to be particularly impressed by her ability.
The nonpartisan GovTrack has rated you as the most liberal senator.
I am prepared to get rid of the filibuster to pass a Green New Deal. There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking.
Would you ban offshore drilling?
Yes.
What is the solution for voters in the fossil fuel industry?
Giving the workers an ability to transition. We're not going to treat people who are undocumented and cross the border as criminals. That's correct.
Raise your hand if you think it should be a civil offense rather than a crime to cross the border without documentation.
Abolish ICE.
Yeah.
Is that a position you agree with?
And we need to probably think about starting from scratch.
Outdated, it is wrong-headed thinking to think that the only way you're going to get communities to be safe is to put more police officers on the street.
Would you support changing the dietary guidelines?
Yes.
The food pyramid. What people
yes.
To reduce red meat specifically.
Yes.
People who are convicted in prison, like the Boston Marathon bomber, on death row, people who are convicted of sexual assault, they should be able to vote?
I think we should have that conversation.
We have to have a buyback program, and I support a mandatory buyback program.
So for people out there who like their insurance, they don't get to keep it.
Let's eliminate all of that. Let's move on. I am opposed to any policy that would deny any human being public health, period.
The more people get to know her, they're going to be particularly impressed by her ability.
Well, you know where we're going in this show. Welcome to Worldview Matters. And I want to add a quote from Trevor Loudon, who said, if Kamala Harris was to apply for a mid-level job in the Department of Agriculture, for example, she would almost certainly fail the security background check. She owes her entire career to sympathizers or active enablers of the Chinese Communist Party. Fortunately for her, and disastrous for the country, elected office holders are not subject to the security clearance process. And the quote goes on. But our guest today, John Loeffler, formerly of Steel on Steel Radio of, I think it was 3 decades, John. Brother, good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you again. We've been doing some video pieces on the Middle East situation called A Stone of Stumbling on YouTube and on Rumble. So
give that channel
I don't miss
again.
that. Good. It's just, if you just go to YouTube or Rumble, search A Stone of Stumbling, my ugly face will come up, and you do it. I do it with Pastor Jason Murray. We go through the history of it, end time expectations by Islam as well as Christianity, and why this
Excellent.
why these are all mutually exclusive and stuff. So it's really interesting. I found.
YouTube, John Loeffler, A Stone of Stumbling. So we're going to get into some of this in the first half of the podcast of what we just heard about Kamala Harris. We've got more notes and more that we can dissect. Definitely, we could do 2 hours or more on her and expose some of her beliefs that I hope, and her policies that I hope most Americans are familiar with, but sadly, I'm afraid they're not. And then the second half, we're going to talk about worldview wars, because this is a spiritual battle at its core. And we're going to talk also about the case for Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to Congress last week, and our relationship, or lack thereof maybe, with Israel during this administration. But what do we call it now, John? Is it still the Biden administration? What do we call this now?
I've been referring to it as the Biden administration, because it's been very clear for a long time that President Obama was acting behind the scenes to actually direct a lot of what was going on. That's why he stayed in Washington. You know, almost every other president's always left. They go, okay, I did my time in office. I'm going back to Santos, somewhere in Southern California, to my ranch. And I guess I sound like a Reaganite, right?
Yes, you are. Hey, so you saw that video. I think videos like this need to be shared often, unless they somehow get someone else in there to run for president instead of Kamala Harris. This needs to be shared because people do not know what she stands for. I just don't have any faith in the American people generally to get well informed. Your thoughts?
Well, I think you're right about that. What really came into what I call the panoply of collapsing narratives was, if you remember, after the debate between former President Donald Trump and President Biden, all of a sudden the left got to see how badly he was doing. And the response, of course, in the media was, oh, who could have possibly have known that? What do you mean? We've been talking about it for 3.5 years. Yeah. And so they've suddenly discovered that their media aren't telling them the truth. That's the first thing, in what I call this gigantic series of collapsing narratives. But everything you read in that series of cuts you cobbled together there, David, as I was doing this, or watching it, I was thinking, that won't work, that won't work, this won't work. And the reason is all of her ideas fly in the face of reality. And everywhere from, say, a Green New Deal. You can't have a Green New Deal because we don't have any alternative in terms of energy. And this is the 800-pound gorilla in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Even if we just all agree, okay, the planet's heating up, it's carbon emissions that are doing it. Okay, good. Well, what else are you going to use for energy? And they go around and they go, oh, wind and solar. Well, we've already seen that they cannot be commercially viable to provide this consistent power that we need to run a prosperous economy. Just can't do it. What's their backup alternative? And the answer is nothing, just absolutely nothing. And what in the first world is something we can debate over and grouse about when, gas at the pump gets to $8 a gallon. In the third world, that starts riots. Because it takes the whole third world and pushes them below subsistence levels. So none of these policies, given where we are economically, debt-wise, inflation-wise, maybe if you did this back in the 1970s, that's when Lyndon Johnson, as president, started his Great Society, and we were going to abolish poverty, which, if you notice, after billions of dollars spent, nothing's happened. And the economy could take a lot of abuse back then. You could get away with it. Now, that's not the case. We're teeter-tottering like this, left and right. And you pile that stuff on top of it, oh my gosh. Do you remember when Obamacare came in? There's another series of lies. You can keep your doctor, you can keep your insurance policy. It'll make everything cheaper. That was all lies. COVID was a lie. It'll keep you from, the shot will keep you from getting COVID. It'll keep you from spreading it. It has no side effects. It was all a lie. And that's why a lot of us anymore are just going, yeah, right, whatever, And so when you get into that, there's nothing sustainable here in this whole presentation. It's why we're not listening to the media. And you and I don't know how you've been, and I started in 1965. Wow. As a matter of fact, she was born in 1964 in Oakland, and by 1968, I was in San Francisco as an apprentice editor at KCBS News Radio San Francisco, all news, all the times.
Okay, well, John, give us some insight when she was Attorney General. First of all, I want to just go back to some notes here that she was 29 years old and she was dating Willie Brown, who was 60 years old, who appointed her to at least one position in government. And she's got a record as Attorney General that if you're a regular American that believes in freedom and the Constitution, it's frightening what she did as Attorney General in California. What insight do you remember or can you share?
Well, she started out in Oakland, and of course, by the late end of the 60s, now she was just a child there, but this is where it got its kickoff. You had the Black Panthers and all of the other revolutionary period, a few of whom are still hanging around today. I was a pretty young buck at the time, so I'm still surviving. I was born right after God made the planet. And so I'm still remembering vibrantly and how vividly all of these ideas were radical leftist ideas. And even at that time, you had people such as the Secretary of Education of the state of California, Max Rafferty, and the media used to look upon him as the dingy Dr. Max. And I remember they'd have me call him and get him on for interviews. And in reality, the man was very sober. He understood where education was going to go and take us, right? And very carefully predicted that. Of course, that's what the whole series has been for the 50 years since 50, 60 years now, since the 60s, that there were radical red flags up all over. And everything she's advocating today was already rolling through the late great state of California, as we used to call it. And they fail. All you have to do is look at where it is right now. They've managed to drive off businesses. They have overregulated to the point I've even had friends that were running major businesses just shut them down and said, we can't survive in California. The green policies are unreasonable. Every policy you can think of, high taxation, high regulation, high crime. And by the way, you can't defend yourself against it because they will defend the criminal and they'll prosecute you for trying to defend yourself, especially if you use a firearm. So nothing has really changed, David, in the last 60 years. Nothing.
Okay. Well, I want to go back to something. First of all, we know she supports abortion on demand through birth. She touted Medicare for all. She believes in forcing taxpayers to fund transgender surgeries. She was raised Hindu, apparently. Her mother, Shyamala, is from India. Her parents met at California, Berkeley. Oh, my goodness. Her name is another name for a Hindu goddess, and on and on. But let's go back to just one example of what she did when she was Attorney General. And thanks to David Daleiden for making this public 4 years ago. She said when she was running for president, David Daleiden, and some of you remember him, his videos exposed Planned Parenthood, his undercover videos. She said it's a bad joke for Kamala Harris to say she's running for truth, justice, decency, equality, freedom, democracy, when she weaponized the powers of law enforcement to attack my First Amendment civil rights as a citizen journalist at the bidding of her Planned Parenthood PAC donors and backers. And by the way, she's received well over 80,000 from Planned Parenthood, who spends money for Democrats every election. But what they did, he exposed Planned Parenthood with these videos, and they attacked him. They, meaning Kamala Harris and the Democrats in California. They raided his home, I believe, at 6 in the morning, if I remember the story right. They launched an investigation into David Daleiden. I believe the organization was the Center for Medical Progress or something. Yes, the Center for Medical Progress, who did those undercover videos exposing Planned Parenthood breaking the law, selling baby body parts, and they went after David Daleiden. They led by
because that's
Harris.
lawfare. In other words, we have to punish you for daring to expose something we were doing. Which is one of the great corruption that we have today, is that the law is being used as a weapon against people who might defend their rights. We're seeing that clear across the board.
It's on steroids today. So what do you think? I just see a tweet come out that says she's got a war chest, she meaning the Democrats, Biden and now Harris, has a war chest of $231 million. John Loeffler, she didn't raise that money. Go ahead.
She's being supported. There was a very good article in Unheard magazine. To get ready for this interview, I did a lot of research and seeing what people were saying on various sides of the spectrum. And her money has always come from left-favoring wealthy people and businesses in California, but they actually tend to run their businesses on a much more conservative basis. It's an interesting combination. I remember a gentleman that I was doing the Financial Sense News Hour with, Jim Paplava, for about 18 years, who lives in San Diego, and he manages big money for big people, Hollywood producers, and all of the people you might imagine that live in California. They can still afford to live there despite the abuse of taxation. And he said, it's really interesting when these clients who may be flamingly liberal, and now I have to say progressive, because liberal really means the classic blue dog liberal, not the today's people hanging over the left side of the planet. But he would say as soon as it's their own money involved, oh my gosh, they don't want taxation. They don't want social programs. They don't want nothing. He said suddenly they go to the other side of the slate and get very conservative. And a lot of that is where her funding comes from. So it's well funded. You can't always point at George Soros for all of this.
So we got to take a break. We're talking with John Loeffler, a little bit more on Kamala Harris when we come back, but we do want to talk about this worldview war, the globalist push, and talk about Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu in just a minute on Worldview Matters.
Today's show is brought to you by Harbinger's Daily, world news biblically understood. Stay informed at harbingersdaily.com.
All right, friends, if you know someone who might be interested in sponsoring the show, please get a hold of us. Send us an email, Worldview Matters at fpeusa.org. Go to our website, worldviewmatters.tv, if you have any questions, and contact us there. But John Loeffler is our guest today. I also want to get your take on, if you remember during the Black Lives Matter riots, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation that was funded by China, driven by Marxists, and also supported by the left. Kamala Harris bailed out felons. The Minneapolis Freedom Fund, I believe it was called. She was bailing out felons out of jail to go back on the streets, and that was during the riot. So she's always, exactly where she stands. People shouldn't have any questions about her worldview and what she supports, lawlessness, and go ahead and your thoughts on that.
Well, in terms of what? Where would you like to pick us? I mean, where would you like to go with that is what I'm saying. Well,
we know that she supported Black Lives Matter, and that's interesting because she has some ties to China, her family, the Chinese Communist Party, and her. Anyway, it's interesting that a lot of people don't understand China's backing of Black Lives Matter and why. And the Marxists that were leading the organization that came out and say, we're trained Marxists. And so you have to know. Go ahead.
The whole purpose was just to divide the culture. That's what it's been all along.
Yep.
Okay. We've had a cultural Marxist war going on since the 60s. The Frankfurt School got here from Germany in the 1940s and set up shop. They were all Marxists. They're called the Frankfurt School. They changed the name when they got here to the Institute for Social Research, but they used to be in Germany the Institute for Marxist Research, which is why they left Hitler's Germany, because they were not very popular there for a large number of reasons. So they got out, they set up shop at the teachers' colleges and began transforming, along with others like John Dewey, the secular humanist, who really loved the way Stalin was indoctrinating his school children. They changed the way Americans began to think. By the 40s, they had control of the teachers' colleges. By the 50s, you began to see the new crop of teachers in the American public school system. By the 60s, you began to see it out on the streets. They were actually referring to the old teachers as effective, meaning the teachers who may have been religious or they had firm belief in the country, etc. And the whole thing was a long cultural march through all of our institutions. They set about doing it. It was very clear. They told you what they were doing, and nobody believed them. Okay. And that's why we are where we are. So what is the first step of all Marxist revolutions? To divide people. You need a dialectic to get going, to have people fighting back and forth. And it doesn't make any difference what the issue was. Black Lives Matter was just a convenient thing at the moment that served as the cultural divider. That's all it was. And unfortunately, so many Americans are badly informed that they don't understand that's what it was all about. And I keep waiting more and more for the African-American community to wake up and say, for 50 years, we've heard all of this blather, but we're not any better off. No,
That's right.
You're not. Because they have no intention of making you better off.
That's right. Yeah. And that goes way back to Lyndon Johnson, who promised to help the inner cities and the black community. And now we've got about 70% fatherlessness in the black home and inner cities, and it's been a mess in poverty. But Kamala views America as a nation thoroughly infested with racism, and I want to move on.
No. See, this
okay, go ahead.
The reason I do this is all of this is part of this dialectical process, whether it's climate change or Black Lives Matter, racism this, racism that, racism this. Let's zoom out. I was a teaching assistant at an all-black high school in the South in the early 1970s. I saw the South right after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. I know what it looked like. We still had a lot of prejudice, and there wasn't segregation. It wasn't legal anymore, but you understand the attitude was still there. I saw it again in the 80s when I was doing documentary work for a company for a couple of years, but I had to travel through the South quite a bit. And I saw it again when I was there for my son's graduation in his PhD program at a major university, which shall go nameless to not start Southern rivalries, which, as everyone knows, in the South are incredibly impassioned. But as he was getting his PhD in chemistry, I began taking a mental tally of the population groups that were there represented in the bachelor's programs, the master's programs, and the doctoral program. And in the bachelor's programs, you had an interesting mix of various racial subgroups. We're not even supposed to be talking about this by now. Remember that, David? We're 60 years in from the Civil Rights Movement. And according to Martin Luther King, this is not even supposed to be entering our dialogue or conversation right now. Okay, as you got to the master's, not so much. When you got to the doctoral program, this really got my attention because there were no African Americans, no Hispanics getting a PhD in the sciences, but the people who were some whites, Indian people, I'm talking about the Indian subcontinent, and Asians, Chinese or otherwise. Those were all the PhDs. And I kept thinking, here we are sitting in a major town where there's a large African American population. What's wrong with this picture? And the answer is that American public education is broken. And it's being run by the people who broke it. They like it broken because it's a great indoctrination mill, and they have no intent to fix it. They're the people that don't want African Americans to have educational choice, because then they'd send their kids to wherever would
better
get
schools, safer schools.
Better schools, right. The key is family values and good education. Why is it? And I asked this question in the 1990s, and my producer said, don't ask that on the air, they'll call you a racist. But I'm going to ask it now. Okay. So you had the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Right about that time, we had a thing called the Vietnam War. And a lot of people came over from Asian countries and immigrated to this country. Koreans, Vietnamese, Cambodians, some Chinese. All right. They set up shop and became incredibly prosperous. They were minorities. They didn't even speak the language. All right. But they set up shop and they were very, very good at doing it. The African-American community for the same period of time has flip-flopped around for all these years, despite the fact that the country has bent over backwards in affirmative action for all of these years. You could get a free ride to go through college on scholarships if you were black or certain other minorities. What went wrong? And racism isn't the answer.
That's right.
Okay. The answer is the difference in the cultural values between the Asian communities and what happens in the African-American communities. And once again, in the 1960s, you had a black middle-class stratum of society, but they had a moral structure. Many of them were Christians. They understood that no matter what was happening in terms of racism or anything else, you still had to try to work at it to get along and to do what you needed to do. That was all dissolved as soon as progressives got a hold of the American public education system. They threw the Bible out and substituted nothing. They began using the schools as laboratories. You know, you can talk about Maslow, Rogers, Bloom's taxonomy, all of these things. I've done more shows on education in the last 30 years than anything else as to how we got here. That has totally failed African Americans. And to this day, people like Kamala Harris will oppose parental choice in education, which would give them the education that they want.
Yep, absolutely. And there's another shout out to one of our sponsors, Freedom Project Academy. John, I just want to direct people, because I want to go on the next 4 minutes, just talk about Israel. Go to discoverthenetworks.org, and there's a page on Kamala Harris. It exposes the left. discoverthenetworks.org, and you get so much more information that we can possibly cover even in a couple hours. So the worldview war, John Loeffler, there's a spiritual dynamic, and the biblical worldview is to support Israel. A lot of Americans don't understand that. Sadly, nobody on the university campuses seems to. But let's talk about Benjamin Netanyahu. He's a very divisive figure, even over in Israel, but he recently spoke to Congress last week. Your quick thoughts?
Well, it's the same problem. The worldview war has existed in the entire West, and Israel is included in that, even though it exists in the Middle East. And it has been a divisive war. Hate Western civilization, hate Christianity, hate the values, hate capitalism, hate democracy, want to overthrow all of that. And that's what we see happening today. Israel had the same problem. You talk about the division there. The people who were leading the charge for, all right, let's just do this land for peace swap and all of this other stuff. In reality, the Palestinians just want to have, peace like we do, blah, 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 which is anything but the truth. If you go look at what was being said in Arabic, that all collapsed. And I mean, it collapsed brutally on October 7th, because a lot of the victims of that hideous terrorist attack were those very voices that had said, let's do a land for peace swap. Some of them were driving Palestinians to medical appointments in Israel. If we just show them kindness, if we just show them this, everything will be okay. That's why he's, quote, divisive. You never hear about a left-wing figure being divisive. Is Kamala Harris divisive? Right. You only hear about that. Whenever you hear about extremists, you only hear about it on the right. And so the first people that are guilty for all of this, everything we see happening here, are the global media.
Thank you.
And they are more responsible for dividing this culture than anybody else. And every once in a while, as I'm a huge advocate of freedom of speech, I just want to say, shut up. You're just creating more problems than you're solving. It was they that drove, Trayvon Martin, Floyd, the Black Lives Matter, they drove it and pounded it and pounded it. And racism, for example, would go away if they would just let it die. We could actually get on with it, because I don't think we have the problem that they think we have. We just don't. And in the Middle East, it's the same deal. But you can't tell friend from foe. Yeah. We're supporting terrorists. We're enabling Iran. If you've noticed, and this is the most important thing, cultural Marxism always delivers the opposite of what it's promising you. Always delivers the opposite. If they say they want diversity, they want uniformity. If they say they want inclusivity, they want to be exclusive. If they, everything that they might claim, they want the opposite. If they say tolerance, they're really intolerant.
Yep.
Okay.
They are. So, the preachers of tolerance are some of the most intolerant people, and the media will say, they just want to. Anyway, I thank you for saying that about the media. I just did a show about that as well, that they are not just complicit, they are an enemy of America, of free-thinking people. Yes. They are, unless you're on the left, unless you're progressive, unless you're on the road to socialism and you want America to lead that way to communism, then the media is on your side. But John Loeffler, we ran out of time already. I just really appreciate your voice, your all these years of research and work you put in, and just thank you. We'll do this again, and God bless you, brother.
And don't forget to pray for your adversaries. You can't win this by hate. You have to win it by love and by reason. And remember to pray for the persecuted church.
Pray for the persecuted church. We'll go out on that note, because we think we've got it in America. When we're called hateful and intolerant, there are people that are dying in other countries, and they're losing their homes, churches, families. So it may be coming to America, but that's to be continued. John, God bless you, brother. Thanks for your time. Friends, we appreciate you sharing the podcast. God bless you. And as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter.